Hello again. The Little Donkey by Avril Rowlands. A king, my mother said. One day you'll carry a king on your back. And she spoke with so much confidence that I never doubted. So I knew from very early on that I was something special. Not just your ordinary common or garden donkey born to live out his days as a beast of burden. I knew I was different from the start. None of the other donkeys liked me. They used to call me names. They said I was proud. I didn't mind. Yes, I was proud. I was better than the other animals on the farm. I was proud that I had been chosen above all for this special job. I had no idea when it was going to happen. Neither had my mother, but it would happen. One day, my mother, who knew about these things, had told me, so it had to be true. One day. I didn't like being a donkey. If I could have been anything at all, I would have been something else. A horse, perhaps, like those in the Roman army, tall and commanding. Donkeys are short, and people think we're stupid, but we're not. We're very intelligent animals. So it was no wonder that I was going to carry a king. The only wonder was that it hadn't happened before. I expect it'll start a trend, I said to my mother. I expect that one day every king in the world will want to travel by donkey, and will live in wonderful stables built out of marble and lie on beds of the softest straw and eat carrots and grass served on gold and silver plates. I was very young at the time. My mother nuzzled me with her soft nose. Where do you get those funny ideas? She asked. I got them, of course, from the camel. Where else? Not that the farmer who owned us was rich enough to have a camel, but one passed through our village from time to time. He was my friend. He had seen everything, and he told me about the palaces he had visited. In return, I told him about the king I was going to carry one day. What do you think my king will be like? I asked. I expect he'll be dressed in a robe of silver cloth with a red silk cloak threaded with gold, said my friend the camel. He'll wear a crown, of course, a golden crown which will gleam in the sun. He'll be tall and commanding, and everyone will shake in fright in front of him and throw themselves on the ground in case he's angry. Why? What happens when he's angry? A king's anger is like a thunderstorm with rolls of thunder and flashing lightning. It's terrible. I won't make him angry, I said. I'll be quiet and patient while he rides on my back. What does it feel like to have a person sitting on your back? For no one had ever tried to ride me, not even the children in the village. That was, my mother said, because the king had to be the very first person I carried. I felt very proud about that too, and didn't mind the other donkeys being rude and stuck up because the village children chose to ride them and not me. It feels good if it's a good person, said the friend the camel, and bad if it's a bad person who digs in his heels and hurts you. But if it's a good person, you'll feel like you could carry him forever to the ends of the earth. What do you do if it's a bad person? The camel curled his lips. I throw him off in the desert and leave him to find his own way home, he said. I wouldn't throw my king off, I thought to myself. I had another question, but I didn't want to ask my friend the camel because he would only have laughed. So I waited until I was alone with my mother and we were munching away on some grass in a field. Mother, what is a king? Now that might sound like a silly question, but I'd never seen a king. I wanted to make sure I gave my first ride to the right person. It would be awful if I gave it to someone who wasn't a king, for the real king would be angry, and I didn't want to face an angry king. My mother thought for a while. A king is in charge, she said. The ruler, the leader. Like the farmer, I asked. The farmer owned the farmland and all of us animals, apart from my friend the camel, of course. He wasn't as I had imagined a king, for the farmer was bad-tempered and had black hairs growing out of his nose. No, not like the farmer, she began, and then thought for a moment. Although in a way you're right. The farmer is the head of the farm. The king is the head of a country and all the people in it. He should make rules that are fair and be a wise person and care for his people. The farmer certainly wasn't like that. We lived in a village called Bethphage and near the Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem. The farm I lived on was a poor one and none of us ever had enough to eat. When I caught sight of my reflection in the puddle in the road, I was interested to see my bones sticking through my furry coat. I was quite small for my age, smaller than other donkeys. Although I was special, I still expected to do my fair share of the work, and it was a hard life. And it was boring. So I had to dream about other things sometimes to keep me busy. Sometimes I used to pity the other animals who weren't born special like me. I would dream about my king. He would be tall and bronzed, and I would know when he was coming, for the air would smell different. Or if I didn't know, my mother would, for she knew everything. My coat would be brushed until it shone like glass, and I would stand in the field holding my head up high. I wouldn't need a rope to hold me while the king mounted, for I would stand still like a stone and not move, even if he weighed as much as 6 sacks of corn. That was more than I could carry. And the king, helped by his courtiers, would sit on my back, and it would feel good, for he would be a good king, not a bad one. Then we would set off. I would try to give him a smooth, comfortable ride, walking round the potholes in the road so he wouldn't bounce up and down. His subjects would be waiting for us to pass, wouldn't like to see the king bouncing around like a sack of corn. And I would take him. Now where? Where would I take a king? To Jerusalem, of course, said my mother when I asked her. Jerusalem? Of course. I just hoped someone would tell me the way. It would be terrible to get lost. He might be very angry, and I wouldn't like to be lost and alone with an angry king. Although it wasn't far away, I'd never been to Jerusalem, but I had heard all about it from the old mayor who lived in the next door farm. At one time she'd lived in the city. Dreadful, she said it was. Streets full of houses, people and carts, smells and noise, no trees to speak of, no green fields, no fresh air. Once was enough, and nothing would make her go there again. She was an old horse that couldn't cope with the city life, I think. I think I would be all right. Then one day, while I was tethered beside my mother outside the house, 2 men entered the village. I'd never seen them before and didn't take much notice. I thought they must have business with my master because they came straight over to the farm, and then they did a strange thing. They began to untie the ropes that tethered us. What's going on? I asked my mother anxiously. Shh! The farmer came rushing out. Here, what do you think you're doing? You leave those donkeys alone. Are they trying to steal us? I asked, but my mother only snorted at me to be quiet. Our master needs them, one of the men said. He'll send them back. Well, that was really no answer at all, so I was surprised when the farmer just gave a grunt and disappeared inside the house. I had no idea, of course, that this was to be the day. I mean, the men who came were very ordinary, dressed in brown homespun robes and a grubby darned and patched cloak. They certainly didn't look like men who had been sent by a king. They led us out of the village, and we saw a group of people walking towards us. I stayed close to my mother, for I was scared. They stopped, and we stopped, and then my mother did an amazing thing. She knelt on her 2 front legs right down in the dusty road. Mother, I hissed, what are you doing? I was so embarrassed. The men who had fetched us took off their dusty cloaks and laid them on my back. I began to panic. Then a man stepped from the group. Surely he wasn't going to mount me. He wasn't my king. He couldn't be. I looked at my mother. Go with them, she said calmly. I looked at the man. He was hesitating, and I suddenly had the odd feeling that he understood what I was thinking. He seemed a nice enough person, I thought, but not a king. Where was his silver robe, his red silk cloak threaded with gold, and his golden crown? Then I had a dreadful thought. Perhaps, I thought, perhaps my mother doesn't know everything after all, and it had all been a story about me being special and chosen. I thought he was meant to be a king, I said. He is a king, she replied. The man climbed on my back. Having someone on your back feels strange. It's different from the sacks of corn I was used to carrying. I could feel that he was alive. He wasn't too heavy for me either. He was just right. I felt as if I'd been carrying him on my back all my life. He was a good man, I could tell it. He didn't dig his heels into my sides. He touched my head gently, and I set off without thinking. I didn't even know if I was going in the right direction. Shouldn't he be dressed a bit more smartly? I asked my mother, who was trotting beside me. Fine clothes don't make a king. But he can't live in a palace dressed like that. You don't need to live in a palace to be a king, she said. This king is a king of people's hearts. But I still didn't understand. We had turned onto the main road to Jerusalem by now, and then a new thought occurred to me. How do you know all of this? My mother smiled. A long time ago, when I was about your age, I carried a girl on my back. She was expecting a baby. It was winter. This baby, she told me, would be a king, not of a single farm or a single country, but the king of all the world. What happened to him? You're carrying him, my mother said. Soon she dropped behind me, for we were approaching the outskirts of Jerusalem, and it was difficult to walk beside each other through the crowds that were lining the road. There were more people than I had ever seen in my life, which was not to be wondered at, coming from our small village. They were throwing down their cloaks and tearing branches from the palm trees and tossing them onto the road for me to walk over. Some were shouting and others were singing, "Praise God! God bless the King who comes in the name of the Lord! Praise God!" It was amazing. Nothing I dreamt about had been as amazing as this, but it was frightening too. Now the crowd seemed pleased to see us, but they became angry. There were so many of them running alongside, waving palms in our faces, staring at us, pushing ahead. The palms felt strange beneath my hooves. I was frightened of slipping, frightened of knocking someone over, and my steps faltered. The man I was carrying stroked my head. Then he bent down and whispered in my ear, "Don't be afraid. I am with you." He wasn't any of the things I thought a king would be. He didn't look as if I'd imagined a king would look. He didn't behave in the way I'd imagined a king would behave, but it didn't matter, for it was at that moment I knew he was a king, my king. He took my fear away, so I lifted up my head and stepped firmly and proudly onto the cloaks and palms that lined the road, walking carefully to avoid the potholes, for I didn't want my king to be jolted around like a sack of corn. Not because of what the onlookers would think, but because it was all I could do for him. I wanted to carry him forever to the ends of the earth. At last we entered Jerusalem, and I took my king to the temple. When I left him, I saw tears in his eyes, but I didn't know why. I only knew that there were tears in my eyes too, and as I went back home with my mother, the road seemed to shimmer in the late evening sun. And I didn't feel proud, just humble and grateful that I had been chosen. And I don't know why I was chosen, for I'm really quite an ordinary, rather silly donkey after all. But I had learnt so many things on that short journey, and especially that camels don't know everything.